Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This last December 6th, 2 months ago, was the 9th anniversary of the imprisonment, the cruel and unjust imprisonment in a cold and damp cell in the most inhuman of conditions of the great Cuban leader in the fight for democracy and human rights in that enslaved island, Dr. Oscar Elias Biscet. Dr. Biscet is prohibited from even walking in the prison's yard, and he is incarcerated along with common criminals. Dr. Biscet was released from prison in 2003 for a few weeks before being rearrested and subsequently sentenced to 25 years in the Gulag due to his peaceful pro-democracy activities. Biscet personifies the opposition to the brutal totalitarian regime of Fidel Castro and his brother, who the dictator has now given some additional titles to because of the ailing tyrant's failing health. Dr. Biscet is an admirer of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. A physician by training, he began his opposition to the totalitarian regime by speaking out against the regime's forced abortion when there is any indication whatsoever that a pregnancy may have an abnormality policy. Biscet described that policy as inhuman. He was immediately fired from his job at the hospital, prohibited from practicing his profession as a physician, and his wife, Elsa Morejon, was also fired from her job as a practicing nurse. Within hours, the couple and their son were summarily evicted from their apartment and their physical possessions thrown into the street. Fortunately, an elderly patient of Elsa allowed the family to move into her house. Dr. Biscet continued peacefully denouncing the totalitarian regime's absolute denial of human rights to the Cuban people, and because of that, he has been unjustly and cruelly imprisoned for 9 years and counting. Hundreds of other brave human rights activists are also suffering in the political prisons of the Cuban totalitarian dictatorship for the crime of supporting democracy and liberty and opposing tyranny, including 23 known journalists thrown into dungeons because of articles they wrote that bothered the dictator. No regime in the world has more journalists in prison, with the possible exception of another totalitarian dictatorship in an obviously much larger nation, Communist China. A few weeks ago, the respected international organization Reporters Without Borders gave one of those Cuban journalists in the Gulag, Ricardo González Alfonso, sentenced by the Cuban tyrant to 20 years in prison in 2003 and currently in very poor health, the Reporters Without Borders Journalist of the Year Award. Reporters Without Borders is to be commended, Mr. Speaker. 3 other Cuban prisoners of conscience, Adolfo Fernández, Pedro Argüelles, and Antonio Díaz Sánchez, are known to have begun a hunger strike due to the brutal conditions they are subjected to. Where is the outrage, Mr. Speaker? Where is the international solidarity? Where is there one word of coverage of this in the world's press? The reality is that for too many in the world today, Cubans are supposed to be content with their lot, to be quiet, to, in the words of one of our colleagues in this Congress recently, to move on. The regime that enslaves a nation and imprisons hundreds of heroes simply for their beliefs deserves unilateral rewards and concessions, many argue, such as more travel or other dollars. But Dr. Biscet and the many other heroes imprisoned in the Castro brothers' Gulag will not be able to be ignored forever. They must be freed, and political parties must be legalized, as well as independent press agencies and labor unions, and free and fair elections must take place in Cuba. Because many of those imprisoned today, Mr. Speaker, will be democratically elected leaders tomorrow. That is what is going to happen in Cuba tomorrow. Today, as they suffer the most unjust of cruel imprisonments, we here remember and honor them, and once again demand the immediate release of all prisoners of conscience in the Castro brothers' infernal Gulag. I yield back.
Mr. Diaz-Balart yields back the remainder of his time. Mr. Brown of Georgia.